Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Welcome to another episode of Robservations, the show about something. This is Robservations episode number 272. I'm your host, Robert Meyer Burnett, the master of fun and wonder, the existential Mr. Rogers, and any of the other names that people like to hang on me. Which I love. I love the more nicknames, the merrier. That's what I say. And for those of you who are curious, the Seahawks are not playing today. They're playing tomorrow night against their rivals, the San Francisco 49ers. The San Francisco 49ers got to give it up. They are undefeated this year. They're at the top of the National Football League, the Western Conference. NFC West, they're at the top, and the Seahawks are just below them. So tomorrow on Monday Night Football, it's going to be a battle royale. To be sure, one that I know the Jedi Knights from the Pacific Northwest will come out triumphant from, although it's going to be indeed a battle royale. Once again, everyone, all you gentle people, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity, you imagination connoisseurs know, unless you're new here, that these chats are brought to you by Lucky Tiger men's grooming products for those men who want to look good and feel great. And if you go to their website at getluckytiger.com, you can punch in PGS for this Post-Geek Singularity community. Your membership in this community, which is free, let's face it, can get you 20% off your order for Lucky Tiger men's grooming products. You know, I spent a long time thinking about what are these conversations going to be? And I've been told that a lot of people just want to listen to me pontificate, but I feel that because I'm always thinking about all kinds of different things in relation to being an imagination connoisseur, that it's sort of my duty to find at least sort of share where my mindset is at with you guys. And hopefully that's part of the show. And then the other part of the show is hearing what you guys and girls and gentle beings and non-binary folk, or however you identify yourself, even if you're, from the planet Klendathu and you recognize yourself as a giant bug, that's okay too. You're all welcome here. But so half the show is me and half the show is you. And I kind of like that because everything you guys send in makes me think. Well, first of all, apropos of nothing, I just want to say that I finally caught up with Aj Alexander's Crawl, his film Crawl. It was released by Paramount, another Paramount hit this year. No, not so much, but it was a terrific film. It's getting a little bit of note in the press now because Quentin Tarantino said it's his favorite movie of the year. First of all, it is a lean, tight, very well made, highly efficient, man versus nature movie, or in this case, girl and her father versus nature. It's beautifully made. It was, by the way, made in Serbia. Every time I see Serbian names, I think of Joseph, I think of Vesna, and it was made in Serbia. Most of the crew was Serbian, and it's quite an effective, very well-made movie. I don't want to spoil it for you. If you don't know anything about it, go into it cold. Don't read the box. Don't read the description. Just start watching. Elizabeth had never heard of this movie. I didn't let her watch. I didn't let her see anything about it. I just started playing the disc, and when the title came up, it's at a swim meet and it says Crawl. She didn't really understand what it was about. And Elizabeth is a screamer. She screams during horror movies. And she screamed a lot in this movie. And what's really interesting is watching. Gilbert does not like when we watch horror movies because he feels it. He feels the anxiety, especially her anxiety, and it really freaks him out. But it was pretty great. Pretty awesome film, I have to say. I quite enjoyed it. Now, there's a lot going on as far as our great franchises go. And I found a lot of articles. I wanted to get into this. And it was, I got to say, Jeffrey Mao, our own Jeffrey Mao, who sent in a letter that really got me thinking about this. So I just did a few cursory Google searches. And before I get to his letter and read his letter, I want to read these articles. There's been a lot made, all kinds of, Doomcock is doomsaying about how there's a secret Skywalker, and George Lucas has had to come in to help fix Rise of Skywalker at the 11th hour. There's Mandalorian spoilers, which, if true, seem pretty obvious to me from the get-go. But anyway, there's just a lot of people talking a lot of mad stuff about our favorite franchises, and I don't know if any of it's true. I don't seek out spoilers, or I really don't seek out um, anybody talking, mad shit about our favorite franchises as they're getting made. Having a bit of understanding about the process, but anyway, it's still interesting. The topic, I like to focus on more general topics, philosophical topics, not necessarily specifics about why this is terrible or why it's good, unless we're talking about Star Trek Discovery. But everything else is sort of, I try and keep an even keel about most of it. But I want to start out by reading 3 different articles about the same subject, Star Wars. This first article was in Bloomberg. It was on the Bloomberg website back on April 11th, 2019. And it was written by Christopher Palmieri and Emily Chong. And the headline is, Star Wars movies will take a break after Episode 9, Disney says. Now, keep in mind, this is important. This is from April of this year. Walt Disney Company Chief Executive Officer Bob Iger said he's not at all concerned that consumers may be overexposed to the Star Wars brand, but the film franchise will go on hiatus after December's big release. Now, he said this back in April, all right? We've not announced any specific plans for movies thereafter, Iger said in a Bloomberg television interview Thursday. There are movies in development, but we've not announced them. The upcoming film, which doesn't yet have a title, is the 9th in the so-called Skywalker saga and is slated for release on December 20th. It's the 3rd installment of a film trilogy that Disney began with The Force Awakens in 2015. After that, the franchise will focus more on TV projects, Iger said. Again, this is from April. We will take a pause sometime and reset, he said, because the Skywalker saga comes to an end with this 9th movie. There will be other Star Wars movies, but there will be a bit of a hiatus. This is a critical year for Disney's Star Wars business. The company is introducing 2 Star Wars-themed lands at its parks in California and Florida this summer and anticipating massive crowds. Yet, there's a growing disturbance in the galaxy. Last year's Solo: A Star Wars Story, a standalone film that wasn't part of the saga, was the lowest-grossing film in the 4-decade history of the franchise. Star Wars toy sales fell in 2018 for the 2nd year in a row, according to NPD research. No less an authority than actor Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker himself, said he experienced Star Wars fatigue in an interview this week. When Solo debuted, some critics said Disney had begun to release Star Wars movies too quickly, overwhelming fans. A film hiatus may help address that. There are other movie projects in development, including a series from Game of Thrones creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, but nothing has been scheduled. In the meantime, Disney will be focused on making content for its streaming platform. The company is creating the first ever live-action Star Wars TV series, The Mandalorian, which will air on Disney Plus starting in November. That would be this Tuesday. This Tuesday, if you live on the West Coast, at 3 a.m. If you live on the East Coast, Disney Plus goes live at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. That new online product will also have another live-action Star Wars series and the animated show Clone Wars. The pivot to TV demonstrates that Star Wars creators at Disney's Lucasfilm are being innovative, according to Iger. He also said that Star Wars Episode 9 would be a hit. It doesn't have a name yet. He said, we think it will be great. Now, that's back in April. He said flat out, we're concentrating on the streaming service. In terms of Star Wars, we're putting the movies on hiatus. That was, what is that, 6 months ago? April, May, June, July, August, September, October. It's now November. 8 months ago. 8 months ago, Bob Iger stated very clearly to Bloomberg that Star Wars was going on hiatus. Not because it was a result of any kind of a disastrous test screening. He said this 8 months ago, which I think is important to remember. This next article, let me see. This article comes from November 4th, from Deadline. Dade Hayes wrote it. Star Wars slowdown is a Disney priority, CEO Bob Iger says. Less is more. Now, Bob Iger has been doing the rounds promoting his new book, which, by the way, is quite good. I suggest everyone read it. Asked in a BBC radio interview about whether Disney has pumped out too many Marvel and Star Wars films over too short a time span, CEO Bob Iger reaffirmed plans for a Star Wars slowdown. While Marvel is doing sensationally well, the Star Wars pipeline is getting a closer look, Iger said during a wide-ranging interview tied to the release of his memoir. I have said publicly that I think we made and released too many films over a short period of time, Iger said. I have not said that they were disappointing in any way. I've not said that I'm disappointed in their performance. I just think there's something so special about a Star Wars film, and less is more. Disney is making the final promotional push for The Rise of Skywalker, the ninth and final installment in the Star Wars franchise, originally envisioned by George Lucas, that is arriving at Christmas time. The company last week parted ways with Game of Thrones showrunners David Benioff and D.B. Wise, the latest of several creative disruptions at Lucasfilm in recent years. Phil Lord and Chris Miller, originally slated to direct Solo, left that spin-off amid differences with Lucasfilm in 2017. The version completed by Ron Howard and released in 2018 went on to become the first Star Wars film to lose money. Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012 for $4 billion. It has since made 3 installments of the main Skywalker franchise, released in 2015, 2017, and this year, a more accelerated pace than the original 3 years between installments, as well as spin-offs in 2016 and 2018. And then it goes on to say that he addressed several other hot topics in the interview. Goes on and on and on. And at the end, he basically said, given all of his dealings with Murdoch, Iger was asked if he watches HBO's Succession. He said he's seen a few episodes. There are things in it that remind me of a certain family, he said, but there's a lot of fiction as well. That was, of course, on the 4th. Now, this came out on November 8th. Ben Arnold, and this is for Yahoo Movies. Disney CEO Bob Iger, so 4 days later, has confirmed that he plans to put the Star Wars movies into hiatus after the release of Episode 9, Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. According to Variety, he made the announcement during an earnings call to shareholders on November 7th. However, he added, rather than putting the whole of the franchise on ice for the time being, the focus is on TV. Now, a lot of people are reporting this as being new information. I want to point out that he said the exact same thing 8 months ago, way back in April. Nothing has changed as far as Star Wars and the movies are concerned, other than, okay, we've got David Benioff and D.B. Wise leaving. Of course, they had their Netflix deal. And then we also have the fate of Rian Johnson's trilogy, which, by the way, was never announced. He was hired to work on it. It was never greenlit. Lots of people get hired in the business to work and develop things that don't necessarily go anywhere. This is nothing new. This is not any kind of vote of confidence against Rian Johnson. Sometimes they develop things that they just don't think are worth pursuing. That happens. It's R&D for what they're going to make. The Mandalorian, the flagship show for the soon-to-launch Disney Plus streaming platform, will air its first episode next week. There is also an Obi-Wan Kenobi series featuring Ewan McGregor in the offing, and a third series centering around Diego Luna's Cassian Andor, star of the Rogue One spin-off movie. Iger added that the first Mandalorian screenings have been for fan outlets and that critics will have to wait in order to avoid spoilers leaking out. The Disney studio boss has mentioned the possibility of putting the Star Wars franchise into carbonite. He told Bloomberg in April this year, we will take a pause, some time, and reset. Iger has also previously said that he now regrets releasing so much Star Wars content. Anyway, nothing has changed. I just want to point out that as far as the Star Wars franchise is concerned, other than the fact that they've moved into season 2 for The Mandalorian, which is a huge vote of confidence for it, nothing has changed. Now, people would say, oh, Rob, contraire, what about the soft opening of Galaxy's Edge? And what about the diminishing toy sales, merchandising, and all of that? Listen, we have Jedi Fallen Order also coming out next week that's posed to probably do big bang-up business. And yes, the theme parks are doing less well, but I don't blame it only on Galaxy's Edge. The attendance all throughout the park is down. The economy changes. People, they raise the prices. I mean, I'm a big fan of Disney. I'm an annual pass holder, and it really comes down to money. And Galaxy's Edge really is quite expensive, and they don't have Rise of the Resistance open yet, so there is only one ride. So there's just not a whole lot to do there. Now, I wouldn't consider Galaxy's Edge a failure by any stretch of the imagination. It's going to be there, and it's going to be constantly developed, and it's going to get bigger and better over the years, as everything Disney does happens. I mean, that's everything that Disney does. So the doomsaying is not necessarily true. Economies ebb and flow, things go up and down. Now, certainly, toy sales are down because, well, we had retailers like Toys R Us close down for various reasons. And the fact is, toys as we once knew them are just different now. The interests of children are different. I think they're more sophisticated. We've got, whether it's tablets or phones or online video games, as I've always said, even I, as much as I love my toys and my action figures, if I was a kid today, I think that I would be playing things like Star Wars Battlefront, and I would be deliriously excited for Jedi Fallen Order rather than getting the next action figure, because one of the things I did with my action figures was tell stories that extended the stories that I already loved, with the characters that I wanted more from them. And there was no way to get anything more from them unless you made those stories up on your own with your toys. But now we get video games. Now we have multiple Mighty Morphin Ultimate MMORPGs, multiplayer role-playing games, multiplayer online role-playing games, sandbox games. There's all different ways to sort of itch your franchise, to scratch your franchise itch, as it were. So to look at any of these one things and point to any of them and go, oh, our franchises aren't necessarily, they're not as healthy as they once were. However, when movies like Terminator Dark Fate come out and underperform, people now this weekend are complaining about the fact, or not complaining, but they're mentioning that Dr. Sleep has opened soft. Dr. Sleep, which is, of course, an adaptation of Stephen King's novel, Dr. Sleep, which is a sequel to The Shining. What's interesting, and we've said this before, the Dr. Sleep film is sort of a very strange hybrid. It is both a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's 1980 The Shining adaptation that King was not a big fan of, and it is an adaptation of King's own sequel to The Shining. So it's serving two masters, really, Kubrick and Stephen King himself, and of course the studio and Mike Flanagan, who directed the film. But it's an interesting hybrid. And I won't get into what I thought of the film just yet, because I want people to talk about it. But I have definitely things to say about Dr. Sleep. Which brings me to the first letter that I want to read, which is from Jeffrey Mao. And I really enjoyed this letter. I thought Jeffrey hits on a lot of points about franchises in general. And then I will go on after this. Morning, Rob. As I mentioned in a previous letter, I wanted to discuss my reasoning for why properties, particularly in the fantasy genre, that attempt to go back and tell a story from the past in a spin-off or prequel series face challenges. However, I thought that I would tie in this idea into a theory that I've had for a while about commonalities in those same fantasy properties. For the purposes of this letter, we'll focus on probably the three most popular fantasy franchises, that being Lord of the Rings, part of the larger Tolkien Imaginarium, Game of Thrones, adapted from A Song of Ice and Fire, and Star Wars. In all three, when we are first introduced to the respective universes in their most well-known works, they are in decline from past prosperity and glory, and we find unrest. Lord of the Rings, Sauron is gathering his forces, trying to find the One Ring, and all-out war looms. Game of Thrones, questions about the legitimacy of the king's children and conspiracies against him soon caused the War of the Five Kings to break out, and in Star Wars, the theft of the Death Star plans and its destruction escalate the Civil War to overthrow the Empire. The situation we are in is essentially caused by multiple downfalls. In Lord of the Rings, the destruction of Numenor and the end of the line of Gondorian kings allow Sauron to stay in power through constant warfare despite losing the One Ring. In Game of Thrones, the doom of Valyria, the disappearance of dragons, and then the end of the Targaryen dynasty. In Star Wars, the failure to destroy the Sith completely, the corruption of the Republic, and then the fall of the Jedi. The situation now incites our protagonists to seek, at minimum, a dual restoration. In Lord of the Rings, the destruction of the One Ring to end Sauron's evil and the return of the king. In Game of Thrones, the reunification of Westeros under one king or queen and the return of the dragons. In Star Wars, the overthrow of the Empire and the Sith and the return of the Jedi. In all three properties, we see the restoration happen, though perhaps not in the exact ways that the protagonists envisioned, but they happen. So the story could be deemed essentially complete, although we know that's not really the case. So now we have the problem that all the owners of the IP or entities who license the IP face, and that is, where do we go from here? The battle's done, and we kind of won, so we'll shed our victory tear, because we have a cash cow in our hands, and we want to keep the cash coming in. What is the next step? Go forward in time? Problem there is it diminishes the impact and apparent complete resolution of the original. See the current Star Wars sequel trilogy for that. Go into the past? Well, that sounds better. There's lots of stories to tell, but which stories? What stories will be so good, so enticing that people will want to watch or read them, even though they know how it ends? The best choice is to cover one of the important downfall stories. I feel that you can't present something which exceeds or surpasses the original in terms of importance. And that's because the most important story is the first one, if it's the restoration story, which it is in all three cases. Everything else has been leading up to it. In other words, you can't make the downfall story greater than the restoration story if the downfall story comes afterwards. If the creator or author starts with the downfall, then ends with the restoration, that's fine because we're progressing forward in time. All three franchises have done or are going to do a downfall story as their next series after the main one. With Star Wars, we saw the prequel trilogy had decidedly mixed results, being, in your words, great Star Wars, but bad movies. Their quality and stature within the franchise continues to be debated to this day. For Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, we have only the next series in early pre-production and not much to go on in terms of what to expect. However, they have the prequel playbook to use to figure out what to do right and avoid what to do wrong. With Lord of the Rings, that challenge is to produce something worthy of the name that meaningfully adds to the original series but doesn't overtake it and doesn't come off like excessive filler like The Hobbit did. The main problem that the Lord of the Rings series faces is that the histories that they're now going off of are very thinly written, and much needs to be added and padded to make up however many episodes and seasons the series will be. It's almost inevitable that they will have to invent whole characters like the unneeded Tauriel in The Hobbit and the dwarf-elf relationship that can't go anywhere. Storylines, plots, and subplots, and this is where the whole series could go off the rails. Game of Thrones has the greater challenge in their newly announced House of the Dragon series. HBO probably feels like they owe us one with the end of season 8. That does not bode well for how the series will be written out and set up because it puts the showrunners in a tough spot. It's hard enough to put together a successful new series, much less feeling like you have to redeem its predecessor. At least Lord of the Rings has the benefit that the original is almost universally loved and praised, and for the most part, people have kind of forgotten or ignored The Hobbit. With Star Wars, everything is off the table now with the departure of Benioff and Weiss. We've had no word if Lucasfilm is even still sticking to the previously announced trilogy dates, but let's say that they will. I say that their next series should be a downfall story. There's no point in it being optimistic when we know that it won't last and there will be another downfall. Perhaps some kind of false victory where we see the Republic fighting the Mandalorians or the Sith Empire. Well, Rob, I hope this is something that makes sense to you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Well, Jeffrey, I thought that was pretty great. I thought that letter you wrote was pretty excellent, and you really laid it out quite well. If I do say so myself, you did. And I think what's really interesting when it comes down to it, the problem with all of these franchises, it doesn't matter which franchise it is, it's all franchises, is that nowadays, if they've already become a franchise, hello, Gilbert, I already gave you cookies. Would you like another cookie? I can give you a cookie. The problem with all these franchises is they're no longer about storytelling. and they're not derived from a place where the stories are first and foremost the most important thing. The most important thing is money. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, all of these franchises that you're talking about, all of our beloved franchises, were all a risk. Oh, come on, Gilbert. They're all a risk. Nobody knew if they would work. Lord of the Rings was certainly a risk. Nobody had ever made 3 movies at one time before. And Bob Shea at New Line, he had the vision to do it. So kudos to him. But it might not have worked. Indeed, the Two Towers, even when they were scoring it in England, it was a mess. They were re-editing and creating the whole Battle of Isengard while the film was being finished in terms of being mixed and in terms of having it scored. They were working on these films. There was no guarantee it would all work out. It did work out in the long run, thankfully. But once Star Wars, no one knew it was going to be a franchise. Certainly George Lucas didn't. When the movie opened, he and Spielberg lit off to Hawaii because he thought it was going to be a disaster. But once these things are proven moneymakers, everybody wants to acquire them. The idea is to keep making money. The problem is that, again, you really should never, to add to the Burnett axiom, you really cannot put your desire to make money in front of your stories, in front of your characters or your stories, because it doesn't work. If you want to make money, you have to have a story to tell, and you have to have the characters in which to tell that story. And I think one of the big problems, especially with the, say, Star Wars franchise, is what they did was they, by definition, because that's what Disney needed them to do, was basically give us a copy of the original Star Wars without really thinking how it tied into the franchise itself. The idea is from a corporate standpoint, and I've talked about this so many times, that it becomes a spreadsheet issue. Here are the elements that we as business people have identified as making Star Wars successful. So we need to give people more of the same. The problem is that isn't what makes Star Wars successful. You can bring down those elements. There's lots of movies that have the same kind of overall elements that, say, Star Wars does, but that doesn't make it successful. The same is true of Star Trek. And the same is true of any great story. It's always great characters and a great story have to come first. And if you're working in a franchise, you already have a leg up. You already know there's an audience out there clamoring for what you're going to give them. But the when you fail to deliver, you fall from much greater heights because there's much greater expectations, and the disappointment and the money lost is going to be a lot greater because there's already a huge expectation placed on whatever it is that you're making. The failure of Terminator Dark Fate at the box office, again, everybody that was involved, James Cameron's involved, Tim Miller coming off Deadpool is involved, Linda Hamilton comes back and plays her iconic Sarah Connor, Arnold Schwarzenegger's back as an aging Terminator who now sells drapes. So you have all of these things that from a corporate standpoint look promising. They look like they should work. The problem is, are you telling a story, and are you using your characters to tell a story that the audience is going to connect with? And my feeling about the Terminator Dark Fate situation is that it's a pretty good movie. By any stretch of the imagination, I think Terminator Dark Fate is pretty good. However, there's nothing new about it. It's all variations on a theme. There's really, the details might be different, but we're basically watching the same ideas that we saw, well, all the way back 35 years ago when the Terminator debuted in 1984. There's nothing. So audiences who are getting new things all the time, the superhero genre is evolving all the time. I mean, we've had 2 shows on TV. Well, 3, you could say, The Umbrella Academy, The Boys, and now Watchmen. I would even throw in things like Doom Patrol. But if you read the comics, this was not really new. But if you were not a comic book reader, and most of the audience isn't, we've been seeing the evolution of the superhero genre even within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Things can't stay the same. They have to change. And that's why I think it's really interesting what Marvel is doing now making their streaming services and their streaming service, the Disney Plus shows that they're doing, whether it's Moon Knight, whether it's She-Hulk, whether it's Captain America and the Winter, or Falcon and Winter Soldier, whether it's WandaVision, whether it's whatever else they're doing, Loki, all of the fact that these TV shows are going to tie into the movies, that's something new. Now, hopefully they'll be able to look into the Scarlet Witch Vision relationship that is a staple of the comic books, but I think it's going to blow a lot of people's minds when they see how far that relationship can go. We'll see where it all winds up, but this is new. What the Marvel Cinematic Universe is doing is new, utilizing the Disney streaming service. Now, I don't know what's going to happen to Star Wars. I really don't know. But I think, like Bob Iger said 8 months ago, their move over to the streaming platform is a good move. It's a good move because it's allowed Star Wars to change and evolve. And however the Mandalorian turns out to be, I would assume it's going to be pretty great, considering they've already greenlit a second season. They're already developing it. We've got 8 hours, 8 hours where they're spending 150 or 15 million an hour. That's a pretty good. What is that? $120 million they're spending on a TV show for 8 episodes of a TV show. I would assume it's pretty great. They're doing something different. It's away from the Skywalker saga. And what I think is really interesting about what Disney has done, a lot of people don't get that studios sometimes develop projects, not just for years, but for decades. And they come back, they circle around. Now, I would imagine that The Mandalorian, and now again, I have no evidence to support this, but just knowing how studios work, I'm sure The Mandalorian uses a lot of what they had developed for the Boba Fett movie. Now, remember, George Lucas also developed a live-action Star Wars show which is about the underworld of the Star Wars universe. They had a lot of scripts written for that show, so there's a lot of material to draw from. And the Obi-Wan Kenobi movie, as we found out from Ewan McGregor, it's been in development for years, first as a Star Wars story feature film that they're now repurposing. So these are things that have been thought about for quite some time. So that's why I'm excited about them, because I think that we're going to be getting what I want to see, which is great stories about characters that we care about, that are new and unique, and they're not chasing. By definition, Disney Plus is a risk. This is Bob Iger's legacy. He wants to go out on a high note. He said he's going to leave the company in 2022, which I'll believe that when I see it, but it'll be really interesting. He's certainly been one of the greatest heads of a company that America has ever seen, certainly in the modern age, taking over an old American company and turning it into something that was quite unique, and really taking it to places. Who would have ever thought Disney would be where they are now? They probably weren't. No one would have thought this 15 years ago when he took over, but because of his vision, here we are. The real question, it comes really back down to, I see a lot of these franchises, unless they have strong figureheads who really know what they're doing. And in the case of even Terminator, we saw Tim Miller, as we know, James Cameron was talking about the epic battles they had in the edit bay. He said that there was blood on the walls that they're still cleaning up. Well, it would have been interesting to see what Tim Miller might have done with the Terminator franchise if he was sort of left alone. He talked about the fact that the opening chase, the chase sequence that's at the beginning of the film was twice as long. Maybe they pulled it back. I don't know. I can't say for sure. All I know is that the Terminator film, Terminator Dark Fate, it's a bloody carcass. It was dead on arrival for audiences. And it's unfortunate because I think it's a better movie than it's being given credit for, but it doesn't matter what I think. The film is a huge disappointment. It's put Paramount into a big sticky situation, coming on the heels of Gemini Man, another very expensive, high-profile movie that underperformed. Skydance, of course, that helped finance Terminator, and who owns David Ellison owns the Terminator rights that he acquired from his sister, who got them, I believe, at auction. Megan Ellison got the Terminator rights at auction, but she, I guess, sold them to David Ellison. I don't know. It's not good when any of these franchises don't succeed. But I think, unfortunately, as with Star Trek, these shows have now become spreadsheet shows. These franchises are all about, Game of Thrones is the most successful television show worldwide So we have to make another one. We have to. Capitalism demands it. We have to make a show. And hopefully, it wasn't unprecedented that one show, look, Cheers led to a show like Frasier, which they're bringing that back. So you can have very effective spinoffs if you have somebody who understands about characters and story. But unfortunately, I think the decisions that are being made with these franchises have not always had the best. Corporations are not the best people. They're not really people, but the people working for corporations have different interests than the people that are storytellers. Now, they meet because the corporations have the money that the storytellers need to make their films. But at the end of the day, the corporations, they're not so interested in, say, whether something is canonical or not. They just want to see whatever the franchise is make money. That's it. That's their only concern. Now, they just assume, well, in a corporation, the way a corporation works, to try and explain what a great character is and what a great story is does not factor into their thinking at all. It's no different than making sure that the rivets in a car engine are done effectively. Why wouldn't it be? You're making a car and you just assume that the car is going to be made well because it's a product to be sold. But franchise properties are not something that you can just churn out at a corporate level. They require tender love and care. They require people that really know how to create great stories and how to tell the tales that really connect with people. And that's hard, even if it's not a franchise. I mean, it's always hard to do that. It's one of the hardest things in the world. Movie making is alchemy, not with corporations. There's no such thing. You have to be able to see it on a spreadsheet. So what I find really, really interesting is with The Mandalorian, I think you had a group of people that were in charge of The Mandalorian. They didn't have the pressure that the Skywalker series put on. Disney, of course, The Mandalorian was just part of their Disney streaming service. Even the point of it was, hey, we're making a Disney streaming service and we're going to have this Star Wars TV show. Well, now what's happened is this Star Wars TV show is now going to be the leader that is going to take Star Wars into the future. And this Obi-Wan series, the Cassian Andor series, which, by the way, if rumors are to be believed, they had to bring in Mr. Gilroy, who pinch hitted for on Rogue One. They brought him in to oversee the scripts for the show, which is good because they're going to make it as great as it can be before it even goes into production the way it should be. Whereas the entire sequel trilogy didn't have a plan, didn't have an overall plan. Why didn't it have an overall plan? Because you would have to have figured out what it was going to be, and what if The Rise of Skywalker, or what if Force Awakens didn't work? Anyway, it all comes back down to the fact that which brings me to the next thing that I want to read. First of all, before I go on, let me see if there's anybody asking me things here, so I can get to your questions. Stubble McShave is here. Stubble says, Disney had their eyes on Star Wars already in 1977. Chewie scared away the mouse droid that was doing industrial espionage for Disney on the Death Star. That's pretty funny. I like that. Royce Freeman says, when should franchises follow the Bond or the Simpsons chronology of nobody ages and they're frozen in time, or Die Hard where they do age? That's a really interesting question. I really like that question. Well, first of all, the idea of Die Hard, well, it's based around the character. It's based around John McClane. And since they never replaced John McClane, once you've replaced an actor to play a character, I think all bets are off, because then you can call Batman. And in the case of John McClane, it's only Bruce Willis. The whole franchise is built around Bruce Willis. And so you've incorporated, when you kept bringing him back, you incorporate his age into the story. The James Bond franchise is interesting because it's based on a literary franchise that basically was stuck in a certain era of time, the Cold War. I mean, it wasn't like Ian Fleming extrapolated James Bond into the modern day. I mean, other Raymond Benson, other authors did. But for the most part, once they replaced Sean Connery as James Bond and made him George Lazenby, and then, well, Connery came back. And then, of course, they added Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan and now Daniel Craig, the Bond franchise could change and grow and be different. I think it really depends. It really depends where you're at. Is your franchise one actor? And the character of James with James Bond, he's a literary character, you know. And it gives you once you've recast the character and proven that recasting can still be effective from a financial standpoint, then you're okay. I think that, look, I really like the idea. One of the great things about Star Trek, in my mind, especially the original cast and the original series of films, was they incorporated the aging of our characters into the stories, which I thought was a great idea. That was a great thing to do because, Wrath of Khan is as good as it is because mortality and aging is a part of that story. And they carried that through to Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 5 and 6. And to varying degrees of success. But I love that about those characters. And what's really interesting, what they didn't allow to happen is then they decided, we have to go back to the basics and tell a story about Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. But we had there wasn't, especially in the last 100 years, we've never really seen franchises that went from a television franchise to becoming a feature film franchise and allowed those characters, the same actors, to age out and end that franchise. I mean, they tried to do something different with alternate universes, but I don't think it really worked. Nobody is really clamoring for a fourth Star Trek movie because the characters, first of all, you're watching not the real characters. If you were a Star Trek fan and if you're trying to make a new film, those characters were not unique enough. I have to say, Captain Kirk, as portrayed by Chris Pine, he did a fine job. I like Chris Pine as Captain Kirk. What let him down was the lackluster screenplay. Nothing gave him, he never had a chance to truly shine the way a real character would, a real franchise character that endures. He was an amalgamation of other non-Star Trek characters. I would say Maverick being the closest one. He didn't have his own identity as a Star Trek character, which unfortunately, I think none of the certainly Spock, the Spock character as portrayed in the Kelvin Universe movies is not a character that I think was endearing to people. I don't think so. I really don't believe so. He was angry, and he was not the fun character Leonard Nimoy created because of the way he was written. And of course, people love Carl Urban as Bones because he was pretty much the closest thing to the original DeForest Kelley version of the character, but he really wasn't given much to do. Those characters didn't work as a triumvirate because they wanted to bring Uhura in as part of that, and it didn't work. So the Star Trek movies never broke through the way they hoped, but that's just me. Royce Freeman says, how often do you see lately films with the head in the box ending or a sucker punch, which is a risk that could fail miserably money-wise for the studio? Well, I'll tell you something. I mean, I think the end of 7 was earned. John Doe planned it. I mean, if the whole point of that movie is that his diabolical plan was played out to the nth degree, and it really worked. I think it really worked. I've told people famously that when I read screenplays for a living, and I read over 3,000 scripts professionally, I only said yes. Normally, you don't say yes to anything. It's either no, maybe, or recommend. You don't usually say recommend is the top. You don't usually say yes. And when I read the screenplay to 7, I thought the whole story was part of the reason it was so shocking was that ending, but it all worked so well. It all made sense. And I like that ending, but I don't think that ending works for everything. The To Live and Die in LA ending, everyone knows how much I love To Live and Die in LA, where your protagonist almost at the 11th hour in the film gets shot in the face. Sorry, spoiler alert. It did come out in 1985. If you haven't seen To Live and Die in LA, I recommend seeing it. And forget what I said. But anyway, that was a shock. I could not believe that when I saw the movie opening night at the King Cinema in Seattle, which isn't there anymore. But I did love that film. But it was earned. It was earned. The cocksure swaggering that Richard Chance does throughout the entire film was only going to lead him to his doom. He was reckless. He broke the rules, and he caused a cop to inadvertently an FBI agent to be killed. he was going to die no matter what. He was fated to do so because that was great storytelling. And but I think that, look, it's not either or. It has to be about what ending best serves the story that you're telling. At the end of the day, you can't just throw in a whammy, whether it's an O. Henry Twilight Zone ending or some kind of a Seven whammy ending. It has to feel like it's earned. And in a movie such as Seven, it absolutely feels earned. It absolutely feels earned. Willow Yang says, what did you think of the Hobbit trilogy? I enjoyed the first two movies, but I didn't care for the last one. Yeah, the Battle of the Five Armies I thought went too far. I mean, there's a lot in the Hobbit movies that I really, really love. And like you, I think, I did enjoy the third movie for, a medieval war film or whatever. But I just thought that the story of the Hobbit, when I read it as a kid, is so sort of simple and charming. But I understand as economic concerns weigh out. Hey, why not? They all did very, very well financially. But I thought the problem with the Hobbit movies is that the tone was all over the place. And while it served the material, you're coming off a story. The Lord of the Rings movies are an apocalyptic tale about the end of the world, about literally staving off the end of the world. And once you've done that, the Hobbit films, I mean, they tried to do the same kind of thing, but the story itself just wasn't really about that. It was a much more simple, more personal tale, and yet they tried to inject this apocalyptic end of the world aspect to it, which they really leaned into for the final film, which I enjoyed watching, but I don't think, the tone of it was wildly hilarious at one point, and then it gets down to being very dark and fatalistic. So I think the problem with the Hobbit films and the reason they're not as beloved is, well, one, there's not as many human characters that you're following, and the stakes are all over the place. They sort of change as the movies go along. But there's a lot to enjoy. Like I do love the first two quite a bit. There's a lot in there that I really like, and I enjoy all of the crazy design work and just how much fantasy overload those movies present. But I don't love them the way I love the Lord of the Rings films. I don't think they resonate with people nearly as much, and I think because of the tonal shifts, a lot of those Hobbit movies they're goofy. They're goofy. I think Peter Jackson needed to rein in because Peter Jackson's a goofy guy. Like if you watch Meet the Feebles or you watch Brain Dead or, you watch Bad Taste, he has a tendency to be a goofball. And I think he was able to pull that back, rein that in with Lord of the Rings. But with The Hobbit, he sort of went full on Peter Jackson, and we saw more of that because that's what he wanted to do. So, yeah. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. Royce Freeman also says, if you recast Bond with someone of a different ethnicity, but all supporting cast are the same, is it the same Bond? I don't think so. I mean, look, if you recast, first of all, Bond is a character from literature. Now, I'm not saying Sherlock Holmes. Look at how Sherlock Holmes has been changed up over the years. Now they're talking about gender swapping characters, and I don't have a problem with that necessarily, but I think that with the character of James Bond, if you're going to change their ethnicity, there's got to be a reason for it that's reflected in the story that you're telling. Unless, of course, you're not going to acknowledge it at all, but I don't think you can, because an audience is going to be like, and a lot of people have said this, if you want to change the ethnicity of James Bond, why not just create a new character that's Bond-esque? Because if you're going to try and change the ethnicity of James Bond, the very change is going to bring more. Are you going to pay attention to the story? You have to surmount. It's an extra obstacle to surmount, I think, within the context of the story. Now, I love the idea of Lashana Lynch being the new 007 in No Time to Die. I think that's a great idea, because the 007 it's a name, it's a license to kill. There's no reason why a woman of color, a female agent, cannot be the new 007. I have absolutely no problem with that at all. As a matter of fact, I think that's really interesting from a story perspective, and it gives you some way to go that's really interesting that we have not seen in the Bond franchise before. I have absolutely no objection to Lashana Lynch playing the new 007. She's not playing James Bond. And I love the idea that a retired Bond who has to come back into the service is going to be going or sparring with or going head to head with the new 007. I see that as a huge opportunity to do some great storytelling. Do I care that it's a woman that's taken over as 007? No. Do I care that she's black? Absolutely not. She looks kick-ass to me. I like the fact that she in that tactical outfit, they had a set picture I tweeted. She looks amazing. And in that Hollywood Reporter article, of course, she looks terrific. I mean, I think she's going to play a pretty great Bond. I would assume, or pardon me, not a great Bond, but a great 00. They've had different 00s throughout the James Bond series, and I have no problem. I mean, we now have women that can serve in combat, and the idea that it's taken this long for a woman to be issued a 00 agent status in MI6, that's a great idea. I love that idea. Bring it on. I mean, what I'm really interested to see is, there are women that have their feminine wiles are different than men. How does a female 007 go about completing her mission the same way that, say, a male 00 would? How does she do it differently? How does she do things that only a woman can do? I mean, I'm really interested. I like stories where women, for instance, men are a sucker for sexuality. I mean, if I was a female 00 agent and I was hot and I had the abilities that a 00 would have to have, would I be beneath seducing my prey, taking them to bed, and then killing them during the act of love? No. I would think that would be really interesting. If I made No Time to Die, I would totally open the movie with a sex scene with Lashana Lynch and make it hot and smoldering, and she's boning some guy, and right as he's orgasming, she cuts his throat. She kills him. Talk about, there's a statement. Let's talk about empowered female sexuality. A woman's using her sexuality to seduce her prey and kill him at his most vulnerable. Heck, that would prove right away that she is one dangerous woman. I like it. Then there's going to be a lot of people that would freak out if you did something like that. But if I was a hot woman and also a 00, why chase somebody down? Why run after them with a gun in your hand shooting when you can have them come to you? Literally. So wouldn't that be something a woman agent could do that maybe a man couldn't? James Bond is never sleeping with his prey, usually. He's going after some dude. He took his pleasure where he can get them. But, if I was a female 00, I'd use everything at my disposal to get my prey. And it would probably be safer in the long run because that person is not going to be shooting back at you. Anyway, I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be great. So it really depends. And as far as the supporting cast, I have never thought of the James Bond movies once you cast somebody else as James Bond, and it didn't bother me. There's been no, and when I was a kid, when I started watching James Bond movies on television, Roger Moore had already been playing 007, so he was the third James Bond. So growing up as a kid, I was not somebody that was paying much attention to continuity. I took every James Bond movie as its own thing. Now, I know someone's going to say, well, the beginning of Diamonds Are Forever is an exact, you're following up with Bond just going after Blofeld because of the death of his wife. I get that, but even Charles Gray is not Telly Savalas, so even that was a little wonky. And of course, there were things like at the beginning of Spy or For Your Eyes Only, when when Bond visits Teresa Bond's gravesite, which is a throwback to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I mean, to me, these things all kind of happen, but I'm not a continuity pornographer the way I am with Star Trek. It's just a different thing. So if they wanted to have, if Idris Elba was going to play the new James Bond and you still had all of these characters, this idea that James Bond is just a name that people use. But it's not true, because if you read the books, he was a naval commander that joined MI6. But with the Bond franchise, look, I just want to see a kick-ass James Bond movie. I want to see a James Bond movie that's really well written, that's really well plotted, has a great villain, has great action set pieces, and delivers the goods. And has, believe it or not, some semblance of verisimilitude, even though the Bond franchise has not. But again, I don't necessarily object to that. I just don't. As long as we get say it with me now, great characters and a great story. I think that's where we're at. Mark C says, of the many problems of Star Trek, of the many problems Star Trek Into Darkness has, Kirk's death scene upset me the most. There's no friendship between Kirk and Spock. The scene was unearned. Well, Mark C, I think one of the great problems with the Kelvin Universe timeline is there is no friendship between Kirk and Spock. They're adversaries. They're adversaries that which I don't understand. And then you go into this riff on Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Star Trek Into Darkness is, dare I say it, I think it's one of the worst science fiction films ever made. I mean, it is so badly written and poorly conceived, not just as a Star Trek movie, but as a film. I mean, the idea of transporters that you can use from a snub fighter and beam from Earth to the Klingon homeworld, the fact that people are in missiles that you're going to use, it is so nonsensically plotted. That film, I mean, it is truly god awful. I mean, god awful on a level, on a battlefield Earth level. The screenplay for Star Trek Into Darkness is absolutely irredeemably abysmal, and I don't understand it. I watched that film and I'm like, I don't get why am I watching this kind of gobbledygook? None of it makes any sense at all, and I don't understand it. But the whole movie's unearned. I mean, the whole movie, I could. Stubble McShave says Patrick Stewart did a photo negative production of Othello on stage in the U.S. He played Othello, and all the other characters were played by black actors. See, I think that's interesting, but it's fine. I mean, I don't have a problem with that, but I guess what's really interesting is I grew up loving British shows all the way back to Jerry Anderson's UFO. If you look at UFO and Space 1999, there's a lot of different ethnicities all working together. One of my favorite British shows that people don't talk about nearly enough was, well, in the UK, it was called Spooks, which obviously they couldn't call it that here because of its racial connotations. But over here, it was renamed to MI5. The show ran 10 seasons. And the first time I saw David Oyelowo, I can't pronounce his last name correctly, but the first time I saw him, he was a badass, and he was on MI5 or Spooks. And his race, when you're watching British shows, maybe it's a function of British television, it's never much of an issue. It's not nearly as much of an issue as it is with our shows. And growing up, I mean, especially like with UFO, there was a lot of racial diversity in the cast. And it just seemed more cosmopolitan. In UFO, you have Shadow was a worldwide organization. So there was people from all over the world combating the aliens. Same with Space 1999. It was a multinational base. And I always liked that. I mean, I think that's a good thing. And I think Patrick Stewart doing it'd be interesting. I wonder how that affected the story, or even did it. I don't know, but I didn't know he did that. That's pretty cool. Koba, our favorite primate, is here from the UK. Koba says the best M was a woman. Judi Dench for the win. I agree. Like, I like Bernard Lee as M, but he's kind of this stuffy old British dude that reminded me of Winston Churchill. But Judi Dench was a badass. I loved Judi Dench as M. She was fantastic. And I think she added a great deal to the series. And, when she's introduced with Pierce Brosnan saying you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War, I'm like, hell yeah. See, that kind of thing didn't bother me because they turned her into a great character. And she actually was able to define where we were with the character of Bond in a few sentences. And, I mean, she was also a woman that was in a married relationship. She was as hard as nails as she was. You never forgot that she was feminine. And I thought that was great. I loved her as M. Loved her. And I'm sorry to see her go. Echo Base Network says, Hail RMB, did you see Doomcock's video on the Rise of the Skywalker screenings? Do you think that is or could be the case with the new Star Wars movie? For those of you who don't know, I talked about Dictor von Doomcock's video that he put up, I think yesterday, maybe the day before, reporting on these disastrous, multiple test screenings that happened where they tried different things. Now, what I find interesting about all of that is this is not unusual. As he put it, the test screening started out okay, they became disastrous, they fixed things, and they went back up. What Doomcock was saying was not unusual as far as Hollywood goes. They try different things. I mean, it happens all the time that you're adding things and taking away things. I am dubious about this secret Skywalker that they're throwing in at the last minute. I'm dubious about that because I think anybody that knows, you don't need to put in a secret Skywalker. Indeed, if Force Ghosts or whomever help Rey at the end, I mean, if they have Rey defeat the Emperor, look, Rey cannot defeat the Emperor. Anybody, if that's the way the movie was written, they've made a huge mistake because the movie is not about Rey becoming this uber Jedi that's going to take out the Sith. They haven't set that up. And if that's truly the way what happened, people were saying that in the test screening, people were laughing because how it was presented was that Rey just defeated Palpatine, which makes no sense. It makes no sense. Now, I don't know if that's what happens at the end of the movie, and that's, of course, what they're saying they had to change and that Lucas came in. I don't know if any of that is true, but they had to change that ending. That was the gist I got from his. I'm sure that seems plausible to me, but like I was talking about on the John Campea show, you can have Rey and Kylo Ren, whatever the hell happens between the two of them, and they're confronting Palpatine in some way. And then, of course, it's the Force Ghosts, all of the Force Ghosts of our characters that we've seen die. All of them. I mean, I would hope they'd bring back all of the Jedi. Coyote Mundi. I mean, come on. Everybody comes back. But what really would have to happen to me, and why I think this is a no-brainer when I'm talking about, when I hear that they have a secret Skywalker come back, I'm like, they don't need a secret Skywalker to come back. Who should come back is Luke. Luke Skywalker should come back. And if they're going to have a battle against the Emperor again, because remember, Luke never defeated the Emperor. Vader did. And if the Emperor is coming back, Luke needs his second time at bat, man. That's what I would do. That's how you fix that movie. The movie is a slam dunk if Luke comes back in some corporeal form with his green lightsaber and wrecks shop against the Emperor, saving Rey and saving Kylo Ren, or if Kylo Ren's whatever they do. I mean, to me, that's the obvious thing. It's the obvious thing to do. Like, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, that's how that. And by the way, Luke has an arc then. He has an arc. He has an arc throughout the whole last 6 episodes, and that's what they need to do. But anyway, who knows if that's going to happen? I don't know. I haven't heard from Doomcock sources, and unless somebody was actually there, I never believe when it comes to Hollywood, it's all hindsight. Everybody always talks about things. Unless somebody was actually there, like in the screening, I don't believe anyone, because telephone things get diluted. You never know. Mark C says, what is your favorite Roger Moore Bond film? Mine is For Your Eyes Only. Mine is absolutely Spy Love Me. It was the first James Bond movie I saw in the theater. I still love it. It still has the most. For Your Eyes Only it goes back to the Bond basics. And I really like For Your Eyes Only a lot. I think For Your Eyes Only is a really good movie. But I think Spy Love Me is my favorite of the Roger Moore Bonds, because it seemed sort of strange that they kind of wanted to strip Roger Moore back down. But I understand after Moonraker. But I do like For Your Eyes Only a lot. I think it's a lot of fun. There's nothing about it I don't like, from the opening scene to the end of the movie. St. Cyril's, the whole monastery ending. I think it's great. But my favorite is still Spy Who Loved Me. Royce Freeman also says, should a female Bond seduce but not go all the way? Or do like the male Bond and do whatever it takes? No, man. I think a female Bond, if you have a female 00 agent, and I mean, why not get off on the fact that she can seduce her prey and take them all the way and kill them? Maybe she takes satisfaction from that. Maybe she's truly, what makes her hard as nails is that she's totally unapologetic for her sexuality. Why? I mean, I think the idea that she would seduce somebody but not go all the way denies her sexuality. I mean, if you're a 00 agent and you have a license to kill, what are you going to do? You're going to have some morality come in about when, in fact, you should actually do it. No, I think if you're going to seduce your mark and your job is to take somebody out, you're going to do it in the way that's most effective. And the time when somebody is most vulnerable is at the moment of orgasm, because they're not paying attention to anything else. That's when you kill somebody. I mean, that's what a 00 would do. You want to take somebody out with no muss, no fuss. And if you can enjoy it, yeah. Is that dark? Sure. Is that problematic? Probably. But you know what? It's also the safest, maybe, unless you're worried about an STD or something. It comes with the territory. It comes with the job. We'll see. I mean, I don't know. I think, why not? I'll tell you one thing. They'd make a big statement if that's what Lashana Lynch's 007 does. They'll never do that. It's too much. That's R rating right there. That's an R-rated killer. And let's face it, our gentlemen or our ladies, if the gentlemen or the ladies are going to be licensed to kill operatives for MI6, they have to kill in a PG-13 way. What I'm describing is far darker. Then you're into a different kind of movie, and I don't necessarily think it's appropriate for the Bond franchise. So I can't imagine seeing it in there. But in this day and age, I mean, if I was a female 00 agent, that's how I would kill somebody, as long as they didn't know who I was. I mean, why use a gun? Why poison them? Why not get them in the most vulnerable position possible and drive a knife right into their skull, right through the nose, or whatever it is? I don't know. Maybe I don't know what that says about me. But you are talking about people who have a license to kill. Now, here's another article that I wanted to read. Bill Hunt from the Digital Bits dropped this article. And this is on aeon.co. It's an article. It's pretty long, but I wanted to read it anyway. Against popular culture. For Adorno, popular culture is not just bad art. It enslaves us to repetition and robs us of our aesthetic freedom. Now, this article was written by Owen Hewlatt, and he's a teaching fellow in philosophy at the University of York. His research focuses on the profundity in music and art. His latest book is Adorno's Theory of Aesthetic and Philosophical Truth, Texture, and Performance from 2016. And this was edited by Nigel Warburton. Now, this is a long article, and I'm sure this book with a title like Adorno's Theory of Aesthetic and Philosophical Truth, Texture, and Performance, that's one academic tome, I can tell you. But I wanted to read a little. Maybe I won't read all of this article, and I'll just put the link in the live chat. But I did want to read this because I found this article fascinating. So I'm just going to start. Classical music and high European culture were at the heart of Theodor Adorno's philosophy and outlook on life. He was born in 1903 in Frankfurt in Germany and grew up with music, both as a listener and a practitioner. His mother, Maria Calvelli Adorno, was a singer, and the young Adorno was a talented pianist. He attended the Hoch Conservatory, going on to study with the Austrian composer Alban Berg. Adorno chose a career as a professional philosopher, taking a position at the University of Frankfurt in 1931, but music and culture remained the focus of his interests. Adorno insisted on high standards. Culture was not merely a matter of technical progress in composing more beautiful, more complicated music, for example, but also, if indirectly, a matter of morality. Music, like all culture, could either develop or obstruct social progress towards greater freedom, and that progress was under threat. Even in pre-war Vienna, Adorno saw warning signs of a collapse in European culture. He would later write of Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which premiered in 1913, that it represented an uproar of culture against its own essence as culture, which is enjoyed as an enticement precisely in its opposition to civilization. The ballet's flirtation with barbarism was not merely musical, it reflected social facts and indeed showed evidence of a kind of cultural trend toward regression and of the domination of the individual by the social whole. These trends toward regression and domination were borne out with the rise of Nazism. Adorno's father, Oskar Wiesengrund, was Jewish, and Adorno's license to teach was revoked by the Nazis in 1933, leading him to spend 4 years at Oxford studying for a doctorate under the philosopher Gilbert Ryle. Together with the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Adorno emigrated to the United States and eventually settled in Los Angeles in 1941. The philosopher who had savaged Stravinsky was now brought face to face with Mickey Mouse. In Minimia Moralia, Adorno wrote despairingly, "Every visit to the cinema leaves me, against my vigilance, stupider and worse." Like many immigrants, Adorno was initially disoriented by U.S. mass culture, which had not yet overrun Europe as it would after the war. This disorientation became a principled distrust. He claimed that capitalist popular culture, jazz, cinema, pop songs, and so on, manipulates us into living lives empty of true freedom and serves only to distort our desires. Popular culture is not the spontaneous expression of the people, but a profit-driven industry. It robs us of our freedom and bends us to conform to its needs for profit. This distrust of U.S. culture was reciprocal. Both Adorno and his philosophical collaborator, Max Horkheimer, were broadly Marxist and were promptly placed under surveillance by the FBI. Their telegrams were intercepted, and one of Adorno's co-authors, Hans Eisler, was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947 and deported in 1948. The FBI distrusted Adorno as a transplant from a Marxist background into a capitalist one. Now people distrust him as a transplant from a privileged background into a progressive one. The easy response to Adorno's condemnation of popular culture is to dismiss Adorno as a snob. His dislike of mass culture becomes simply a dislike of the masses that he looked down upon. He seems patronizing, seeing people as easily fooled and misled, and popular culture as shallow and manipulative. In this version, Adorno's arguments against popular culture contain no insight, only elitism, while in fact, popular culture pleases and gives a voice to ordinary people. But this easy response is misguided. Adorno did not simply condemn popular culture, nor did he simply yearn for the rule of high culture. He found grave problems with both, and these problems stem from Adorno's profound respect and demand for pleasure, driven by a strong moral concern for our well-being. Strange as it might seem, Adorno's broadsides against popular culture are driven by the desire to identify and avoid harms to our flourishing. Popular culture is not only bad art, though it is that, he claims, but harmful art. It stands in the way of our true freedom. I'm reading this article, I hope you get by now, that this sort of reminded me of Martin Scorsese's recent comments about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He sounded very Adorno-esque in his commentary. Certainly Coppola did as well. To get at this moral position, we might consider a familiar example: guilty pleasures. We are now, on average, working longer with less security for less money. The world is riddled with social and political problems that we have no immediately clear way of engaging with or ameliorating. Our limited free time seems better spent instead on relaxing the demands we place on ourselves and escaping the pressures of the everyday world. While guilty pleasures are imperfect, they afford us a pleasure too often lacking in our busy lives. They supposedly give us more immediate enjoyment than high art, while certainly demanding less time, attention, and expense. See, what's very funny to me about this article is everyone, all of you imagination connoisseurs, anybody who spends any time on YouTube, as I do, watching videos about Star Wars or Star Trek or the MCU or Terminator, we are certainly not being given more enjoyment than from high art. And low art is certainly not demanding of less time, attention, and expense. I've spent more time in my life pontificating the ins and outs and whatever of Star Wars and Star Trek in my lifetime. I don't even think anybody who spent a lifetime writing, I don't know, their monograph on whatever their favorite artist was. I've spent a lot of time on it. And I think everybody, all of you imagination connoisseurs, Star Wars is in fact our high art. Now you could say, or Star Trek as well. Yes, of course, it's a collaborative art. That's what film is. And I understand if you're a fan of an impressionist painter and you know everything about their work, it's a single author. So I get it. I understand. A single visionary, a single artist. I totally understand that. But I don't think that anybody who spent any length of time pondering Star Wars or Star Trek would say it's any lesser a form of art than somebody who paints pictures or writes symphonies or dances. I think art is art. And it's very interesting to, of course, it's commercial art. Anyway, I could get into that. But anyway, I'm just going to read a little bit more of this. Adorno is no opponent of pleasure, but he would be very suspicious of guilty pleasures. What sort of a world binds guilt and pleasure together? What sort of a pleasure comes together with an awareness, no matter how dim, that things should be better? It is a world, Adorno claims, that gives us only a faint copy of pleasure disguised as the real thing. Repetition disguised as escape. A brief respite from labor disguised as a luxury. Popular culture presents itself as a release of our repressed emotions and desires, and so as an increase in freedom. But in truth, it robs us of our freedom twice, both aesthetically, in failing to give aesthetic freedom in enjoying art, and morally, in blocking the path to true social freedom. What does it mean to lack aesthetic freedom? For Adorno, this is about freedom in experiencing, interpreting, and understanding artworks. This freedom requires an artwork to give us space and time to inhabit it and to experience it as a unified whole. However, popular culture has lost its ability, Adorno claims, to create these integrated, unified wholes. Instead, works are now being produced that are a loose collection of moments experienced in a rapid and disconnected series. It's not uncommon to hear films praised for their set pieces and special effects. If we look beneath the familiarity of this language, we find strangeness. We praise a 2-hour film for the enjoyable and expensive moments it contains. The chase sequences, the explosion, the action choreography. We're accustomed to breaking down what is presented as a single thing into a collection of disconnected smaller things. This is a claim about how we experience films, but we can find examples in how we talk about films too. For example, on the AV Club, we can see a list of the best scenes of 2017, a list of dismembered sequences taken from films and described in isolation. Going yet further, Variety magazine lists the top 10 shots of 2017, or still images isolated from the films, the motion even, that lend them meaning. Anyway, I love this article. It goes on to talk about a lot more interesting things. I am now going to post this in the live chat. I would suggest you all read it. It is, in fact, quite illuminating and fascinating. And again, I think this is what the internet's the best thing for. You know, you can zip around and find all kinds of interesting stuff. Do It for Cash says Parasite was stellar, more humor than I expected. Look, Parasite's probably going to win Best Foreign Film. I mean, obviously, there's still some time left. Bong Joon-ho is an incredible director. You know, I found with it's really interesting. I mean, I think American audiences or Western audiences, we're always surprised when we watch Asian cinema and we find out just how accessible it really is, especially modern Asian cinema. And some of it is so transgressive. I mean, I'm not surprised by. I think humor. You travel around the world and you find out that humor bonds us a lot better than we might think. Sure, there's colloquial humor, obviously, but I think he's a fantastic filmmaker. And if you delve into his past, he's done a lot of things beyond Snowpiercer or this, and it's worth taking a look. But yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I'm glad you went to see the film. I got more letters to read. Actually, I have lots of letters, and I'm once again falling behind on the letters. This is an interesting letter. I'll read this. I like this. Ian Samuels, he has written something. Ian, of course, is one of the cornerstone members of the Post-Geek Singularity. He sends a lot of letters in. I mean, obviously, I don't read a lot of, I can't read everything he sends in because he writes a lot, but I think of all the letter writers to the Burnettwork, he's written the most that we've published on the website, if memory serves. So here's something I thought was pretty interesting. So this is from Ian Samuels. Rob, a potential character connection has fascinated me for many years. In the film Psycho, the character Marion Crane is murdered by Norman Bates. Marion's boyfriend arrives to investigate and is the one who apprehends Norman and takes him to the authorities. That character's name is Sam Loomis. In the film Halloween, the psychologist played by Donald Pleasance, who is treating the child Michael Myers, is named Dr. Sam Loomis. I have, for some years now, considered the possibility of writing a book entitled Loomis, following the character of Sam Loomis after the murder of his girlfriend and the apprehending of her killer. Finding himself fascinated by the mind behind the act of killing his girlfriend, Bates' connection to his mother, etc., leads him into studying psychology. After graduating with his degree in psychology and his PhD in child psychology, he relocates to Haddonfield, where he becomes involved with the case of a disturbed child who has committed murder, a child named Michael Myers. There's been a number of horror film fans since that have made the connection as I have. Is it too late to write this book, or is it worthwhile? Well, Ian, I love this idea. I mean, this is a Halloween prequel that I could absolutely stand behind, but I think it was definitely intentional. I've never heard this before, but I think if you asked Carpenter, he would say that, yeah, I got that name. Absolutely. I love this idea. I think it's cool. I mean, yeah, if you came up with a great story, why not? But then again, you'd have to get the rights. You couldn't publish the book. You'd probably have to get the rights from John Carpenter. But I think it's really cool. I really like this idea. Yeah. Here's another letter that this is kind of interesting. Douglas Root, quickly. This is a quick one. Hi, Robert. Been enjoying your afternoon live streams for a while now. Since you mentioned that you enjoy answering questions about the film business, I have a question. Can you explain the business model, revenue share for distributors, and why can't studios distribute on their own? Is there usually more than one distributor involved in a film's release? Do they compete for these rights, and what other options are involved? Additionally, where do movie theaters sit in on this business model? Thanks so much for your insight. Well, Doug, for the most part, look, studios, and when I say studios, I'm thinking the majors, Warner Brothers, Disney, Fox, Universal. They pretty much do distribute their own movies worldwide. However, some studios, in order to say, well, obviously Terminator is one of these. 20th Century Fox was one of the financing entities that made Terminator, so Disney ended up distributing Terminator overseas. So sometimes we have different there are certain studios that make a film, and because they were financed or however that works, they're different people that distribute these things overseas as well. Or, sometimes, and I don't know how, I'm not quite up on this. I don't know if films, say, that are released in China are allowed to be released by, say, Warner Brothers or Universal. They may have to partner up with a Chinese distributor. But for the most part, the major studios distribute their own movies. In which case, because the studios are covering the costs or partnered up, they also can control the distribution. Now, Disney famously created Buena Vista Distribution, that they have a separate company that was distributing all of their movies. So Disney would make the movies, and then their distribution arm, Buena Vista Entertainment or whatever, would distribute the films. to keep it all straight. Now, I think what you're asking though is what happens when a independent movie or a smaller movie is picked up by a distribution company, and like an A24, for instance. Although A24 is getting into financing their movies, but I love A24. They recently released The Lighthouse, for instance, and they released Robert Eggers' first film, The Witch. And how that works is usually, well, I'll give you an example. So say I can from my own past that didn't come to pass, but this is how it works. So when we were making Free Enterprise 2, all right, we had a certain budget that we had to cover. We have the budget of the movie. And the idea is what you want to do as far as independent films go, at least my rule is you want to return the investment of your financiers. And they could be a lot. In the case of Free Enterprise, we had 8 different financiers, individuals, not companies, but individual financiers that were going to put up the money for the movie. And the budget, I'll just say it was like $8 million. Budget for Free Enterprise 2 was $8 million. And one of the things that we did was we had a pending deal with a European distributor. I won't say the name of the distributor, but they would give us what's called an MG, which is a minimum guarantee. And their MG for Free Enterprise, and I believe it was distributing across 4 territories. Their MG, if memory serves, was like $2.5 million. So what we would then do is we would give the film, we would deliver our film that we made, and they would pay us, they would guarantee us that we were going to get $2.5 million back. So we knew that $2.5 million of our $8 million, our budget was covered, which is pretty good. Now, what you do when you make independent films is you can carve out different territories. Like we could sell it in Central America or South America. I mean, we could sell it to Asia. We could sell it to other different European companies that this first European distributor didn't cover. And you look, an independent movie, you might distribute it in a territory and they might pay you $25,000 because it's a small market. And what you do is then you turn over the film and they distribute it within their territory that they've paid for. Now, if you're a big studio, you can afford to release a movie all over the world. You've got the money, which you can borrow from a bank. So that's what Universal does, or what, for the most part, the big studios release their own films. But if you're a small distributor, what you try and do. So if we would sell Free Enterprise, The Wrath of Shatner, we had that European distributor with a $2.5 million MG minimum guarantee. We knew we were going to get that. Now, what we're looking for is a domestic deal. So if we had a domestic deal from, say, A24, God, that would have been great because I love A24. But say they're going to take it for North America and they're going to buy the rights. Now, they'll probably end up buying the home video rights, all the rights. If you sell it for A24, they're going to take probably the world, but you never know. However your deal is going to be made. But let's just say that they bought it for $5 million. So we sell it to North America for $5 million. So now we've spent $8 million and now we have $7.5 million covered in our sales. Now, what we're hoping is that we have a piece, say we sold it nowhere else, but then there's home video. Now, depending on your deal with A24, they're going to want to go off and sell it to a streaming service or whatever. But I mean, it can get very complex. And one of the frustrating things about being an independent filmmaker is, I'll give you an example, what happened with Free Enterprise 1. And here is how independent filmmakers get fucked. Pardon my French, but they get fucked all the time. So we sold Free Enterprise to a company called Regent Entertainment. All right. Now, Regent Entertainment will go to, say, the Cannes Film Market. When the Cannes Film Festival is going on, they're also having a film market with a lot of films that will never play in any film festivals. But so during the Cannes Film Festival, there's this big market where a distributor like a Regent will try and sell all of their movies to different territories all over the world. Well, what they do is say Regent has 10 films, right? They might have 1 or 2 movies that people want and 8 movies that are, not so hot. But what they do is they charge back the costs of going to Cannes to all of those films. Each individual film ends up covering the cost that it costs to go there. So say it costs $300,000 to go for Regent to go to Cannes to sell the movies. They'll charge my movie $300,000, and all the other 9 movies will each have to pay or get $300,000 taken out for marketing costs or whatever. It's a total and utter scam. But that's also what the studios would do. When people talk about studio accounting, they'll charge the entire overhead costs of a studio. How long did it take to run a studio during the production of whatever movie? They'll charge that against the movie that's being made. And if a studio makes 10 movies a year, they'll charge their operating costs 10 times over, because their operating costs caused this movie. That's what, while the movie was in production, the whole studios, all of their efforts were donated or being utilized to make this one movie. And if they made 10 movies, they do it 10 different times. And that's where crazy accounting comes into play. But it's not illegal, and it's not necessarily wrong. So it's a little hinky. So studios do distribute their own movies. Now, when studios owned their own movie theaters, that's when things started to get crazy. There were laws passed, although those are changing now. So movie theaters, movie theaters are their own companies. So what happens is in Washington State, for instance, when I was younger, movie theater chains would bid on the movies that were going to play in their chain. And they would bid saying, okay, we're going to give you whatever percentage of the box office. And if they thought the movie was going to be a hit, like say you have 2 movies that are going to be opening on the same day, right? One movie theater chain might want one, and the other movie theater chain wants the other. And they'll say, okay, we're going to give you 50% of the box office or whatever, or 60% or 70% of the box office, and they'll make deals. And then it'll be say it's a 60-40 split or a 70-30 split. And so the theater will get 30% of the box office, and the movie studio, the distributor, will take 70% of the box office. And that's when you sell concessions, because once everybody comes in. So that's how that works. I mean, the theater chains make deals with the distributors about how much they're going to pay based on their ticket sales, what percentage they get back. So that's kind of how that works. I don't know if I did a very good job of answering that question. It's not that difficult, but it's complex. It can be complex. And it's also a very it's a lot different when you're a distributor that doesn't have the credibility. If you're a major studio, it's much easier to make deals with movie theaters than it is if you're not. And if you have a big project, a high profile movie, that's why marketing, the more awareness there is, the better deals you're going to get. And the more money that somebody has to put behind a film, as far as marketing is concerned, it affects the economics of a release of a movie a lot. But it's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. I like that, actually. I like that you asked. Let's see. Mark C is also here. Again, Mark, always a great supporter of the channel. I thank you for that. Mark C says, the only reason a pleasure is guilty is due to shaming by ionosphere sniffing academics like this a-hole. Well, here's the thing. I'm going to take Star Trek. I'm a Star Trek snob. I mean, I as somebody who's well-versed in the genre of science fiction, I've read a lot of classic science fiction. I've thought about a lot of science fiction concepts are rooted in actual science. And I think some of the great questions of life are pondered within Star Trek. Now, somebody would say, well, Rob, the great questions of life are all pondered in philosophy as well. And I'm like, yeah, okay. I understand. I went to college, the ontological, the teleological, and the cosmological arguments against the existence of God. I mean, all that stuff. And I get it. I could delve right into philosophy. But the problem is philosophy is not as fun for me as watching episodes of Star Trek. I want what I would get out of philosophy. I want to get the same thing out of Star Trek. Now, there's some people that can watch Star Trek and they just want to see the spaceships, they want to see the heroic characters, and they want to see people kicking ass, and they want to see it the accoutrements of the monsters or the aliens or whatever, and they don't think too much about it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But Star Trek is a place where I expect more. I think Star Trek, as far as an action adventure, science fiction allegory, I think Star Trek did a wonderful job of doing both things, giving you a lot to think about and at the same time providing you with pulpy adventure stories if that's all you were looking for. It does both very, very well. I think over the last decade, there has been an imbalance. I think that the storytelling in Star Trek doesn't have enough of the heady issues, and it's become rather than setting trends and boldly going where it has never gone before, it's retreading the ground. Not only it's gone on, but it's retreading the ground we've seen in many different franchises, and it has very little literary sci-fi in it. And that's what's really bothered me. So I'm a snob when you talk about academics, shaming by ionosphere snarfing is I don't know if that word is what you meant to say, but I love that comment. But I mean, that's what I want for my Star Trek. I like highbrow Star Trek. I think Star Trek at its best is when it is highbrow, when it is trying to seek out to do something unique and unusual that we don't usually see. And I don't like to see it getting dumbed down. And what I also think, too, is that most people respond to things that aren't dumbed down. You know, Star Wars, the original Star Wars is sure very classical. It's it's accessible to audiences. But there's a lot of stuff going on in what seems to be a standard pulp sci-fi fantasy framework. But there's a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of meat to grab onto. And it's presented like, and I always go back to that scene in the Death Star, you know, that first scene in the Death Star, when whether those are regional governors or whether there's just those are the commanders underneath Tarkin or whatever, the fact that they have that conversation and there's all that world building in that one room, you learn about the Force, you learn about the regional governors, the bureaucracy. It is such a beautiful example of storytelling and world building all at the same time. It's a pretty sophisticated bit. And you learn a lot about the universe, and it seems more realistic and much more intriguing. I miss those kinds of interactions. I mean, the First Order, General Hux, whatever his rank is a cartoon character. You know, you've never. I don't believe that there's anybody in charge of the First Order. The First Order I would never believed in it. I never believed in any command structure. You're laughing at them. It's almost a Simpsons parody the whole time, and it's such a weird thing. Star Wars never did that. Star Wars made you believe, man. And I wonder. I think there's a lot of filmmakers that don't understand why a scene like that works as well as it did. And I think there's a lot of people that don't get that. I think that the perception of what Star Trek is, that when you go back, there's a lot of people that are incapable of taking it seriously. They look at the things that pop culture has drilled into their brains. Red shirts die. Kirk loves women. He's a womanizer. You know, and all of that taints their ability to look at an episode of classic Star Trek and watch what's really going on. They're just smiling knowingly at their hipster understanding of what Star Trek is. I mean, it's funny. I put on a little bit of Galaxy Quest. I love Galaxy Quest. But what's interesting about Galaxy Quest is that the Galaxy Quest TV show, as portrayed in the movie, is campy. I understand it's supposed to be, you know, they have to make it that way because they're playing off what the popular culture memory of what Star Trek is supposed to be. But the fans of Galaxy Quest and the Galaxy Quest show, as depicted in the movie, is very cliche. And I understand it's a shortcut to making that movie work. And I love Galaxy Quest, but when you look at it, you're like, huh, okay, I get it. I totally understand where they're at here. But it bothers me because I feel that everybody who's taken on Star Trek, especially in the last 10 years, has looked at it as the television show that is depicted at the beginning of Galaxy Quest and not really what it is. Because in our pop culture sense memory, I think there's more people laughing at Star Trek now than are not laughing at it. And when they try and come back and do new Star Trek, they're like, we're going to now make this more serious and more palatable and more important, when it always was more important. Just like Star Wars worked so well because it was timeless, but it wasn't dumbed down. And I just think that a lot of our franchise science fiction, season 8 of Game of Thrones was dumbed down. It was dumbed down. She's finally going to go crazy. No, that's not the way it was supposed to work. That's not the way those characters were built up over 8 years. And I think what people are really objecting to is Game of Thrones was a very serious, very highbrow show in a fantasy context. And what happened was, especially in season 8, it was dumbed down. And that's what people really objected to. It's to the point where, the Night King, she's just a monster. And I think that's what people are missing. And I think that's what's inherently not understood when we see our franchises, when they sort of don't deliver what they're supposed to deliver. I think Star Trek has been dumbed down, and I think that The Force Awakens and Last Jedi are dumbed down. And I think that's the true death of the franchises. When you have new creators who come onto these franchises, and they, in the back of their minds, that's why I keep going back to what Ryan Coogler did in Creed. Ryan Coogler did not dumb the Rocky franchise down. Even the Rocky franchise dumbed itself down. As much as I like Rocky 3, it's goofy fun. Rocky 4 is even goofier. I mean, my God. Creed elevated the franchise after Rocky Balboa, which also elevated the franchise. Creed took it even further. Creed took it to the same heights that maybe not the first Rocky had, but in terms of what Ryan Coogler did for Creed, is he put back thoughtful, intelligent franchise filmmaking back into the Rocky franchise. Not that it wasn't there, but if you look at Rocky 1 and 2, and then you look at Rocky 3 and 4, Rocky 5, the less said, the better. But Rocky 6 and Creed do a really good job of elevating that material back up, maybe not to the heights of Rocky 1, but certainly in the vicinity. And I think that's what we have to concentrate on. That, that's the way that we make great franchises stay great. Well, what? Speaking of franchises, I want to talk about this. I'm going to read this letter. This letter comes from Rick Green. Hello, master of fun and wonder. I've been watching the first season of Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime, and I'm finding it to be very well done. How true of a depiction of terrorism and such, I don't know, but it seems accurate to me. Either way, it's a fun watch. Although I can't help but I keep thinking of the Office TV show whenever I see John Krasinski, especially in a scene where he's in an office. I sometimes have to block out the theme from the Office TV show from my head, and it's not always easy. I first expected that Jack Ryan would be so deep it would require more of my attention and brain power to understand it, but it doesn't. It begins to flow very well after the first couple of episodes, and I'm almost done with season 1. Well, Rick G, Jack Ryan is a franchise now. There's been 5 Jack Ryan movies made in the theater. Of course, there was Hunt for Red October, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, Sum of All Fears, and Jack Ryan's Shadow Recruit. And then we have the Jack Ryan TV show, of which I just recently finished the second season. I really liked the first season. A very familiar story. If you've been watching 24, you've been watching MI5, I mean, the story of terrorists like that. but I thought it did a pretty good job. It was pretty engaging. And what I really liked about season 1 is Jack Ryan, they really laid into the fact that he was an analyst that shouldn't have been doing field work, but he was also a Marine, a former Marine, so he could. And I love the relationship he had with Greer, who later becomes Admiral Greer, that was played by James Earl Jones in the franchise. I really enjoyed Greer and Ryan's relationship. I thought the first season of Jack Ryan was really well done. It was tightly written, tightly constructed, and I enjoyed Krasinski's character. I was never an Office watcher, so I didn't have that problem, but I thought he was great as Jack Ryan. The second season, I felt that it was quite a step down from the first season. I thought the fact that they recreated some set pieces from the Clear and Present Danger. I mean, they recreated 2 in particular that are a big part of that movie. And I was like, your setup, they had a really compelling setup for Jack Ryan season 2 about the destabilization of governments and all that I thought it went they really didn't delve into it as much as I thought. And I was disappointed by that. It was fine, but it seemed like they stretched out 4 episodes of story into 8 episodes. I really don't think they did nearly as good a job. And again, the Tom Clancy books that are so painstakingly researched, it let me down. But look, I want to see that. I really enjoyed, and even the end, it felt lazy. It felt to me like, okay, we have to come up with a new story for Jack Ryan. Let's go pillage Clear and Present Danger, which is a really good movie. I really like Clear and Present Danger a lot. And yet they had this great premise that was very different than Clear and Present Danger. And I wanted the premise, I thought, was great. And I wanted to know, what does that mean on more of a global scale? I thought that we were going to see a lot more than we did. But, I do like the Jack Ryan franchise. I like Krasinski as Jack Ryan. He really got to flex his action muscles in this season. I hope they come back with a stronger season. But it's interesting. It reminds me a lot of Homeland as well, which I also think is a good show. But yeah, I think Jack Ryan, the first season especially, I quite enjoyed it. But again, it's a franchise. Jack Ryan is a franchise that demands it be smart. It's really interesting. One of the great tragedies in terms of franchise filmmaking goes, I would like to have seen them just follow. If they had made a series of movies that follow the books, the Jack Ryan novels, where eventually Jack Ryan becomes in executive orders after Debt of Honor. If you read Debt of Honor, it ends, well, if you've ever watched Designated Survivor, the end, or 9/11, Debt of Honor, the Tom Clancy novel, ends with fringe Japanese terrorist group crashing an airliner, into Congress when the president is delivering a speech, killing everybody, and Jack Ryan ends up as president of the United States. This, by the way, was pre 9/11. And then that was the end of Debt of Honor. And then, of course, it leads into the next book, Executive Orders, which is, I love Executive Orders, but that is Jack Ryan becomes president of the United States and all hell breaks loose because all of America's enemies decide to take that into consideration and move against us. And if you watch the first 10 episodes of Designated Survivor, man, I was like, this is just Executive Orders done as a TV series. And that's why I love the first 10 episodes, and then the show went to hell. But anyway, that's just me. Well, listen, everybody, I think I'm going to bring an end to this Robservations number 272. I want to thank you all for being here. If I could ask you to like these chats and subscribe to these chats, it's always helpful as far as YouTube analytics are concerned. I want to thank my moderators. I want to thank Louis Yu and, of course, Jordy Lyons, who are new moderators. Then, of course, there's Greg Smith, Detective Jim. Always good to have Detective Jim here, keeping everybody honest. Terry, the Sheriff of Nottingham, and for a second term, the newly minted Honorable Mayor Mike Bodden, who administers the website and all those things. I want to thank them for the tireless work that they do, and they make this, the Post-Geek Singularity, a place where it keeps everybody, on their toes. And I want to thank them for that. I want to thank all of you for supporting the channel, for submitting through Super Chats or joining on the website or even Patreon, all of those things. I want to thank you for that. And I'm going to end this Robservations number 272 on our march to 300 episodes. People, if you want to send me videos, send me links. I'm going to figure out a way. People have asked, well, how can I send you videos? A lot of people want to contribute. And I am going, my big 300 show, remember, December 7th. And I know I'm going to have to do two more, an extra show before I get there. But December 7th is going to be my 5-hour on Saturday, December 7th, the 40th anniversary of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. I'm going to be doing a 5-hour show, and I'm going to have video packages. I'm moving into a different set. It's going to be all great, and you should all get ready for that. I want to thank all of your letters, and if you want to send me letters, please send me more at theburnettwork.net. I want to point out that Allie State, our first columnist on the website, technically, I guess you could say that Willow Yang is the first, because we gave her own section, Willow Talk, but we also have made Allie State our first correspondent. She is getting her master's degree in journalism. She has her Feminerd Gaze column on our website. She has a second episode about why Raylo is a thing that we need in our lives, but her first column was about her love of Batman, the animated series. So check out Allie State's column on the website, the Feminerd Gaze. And I want to do more of that as we go along, as we get bigger. But ladies and gentlemen, all people who watch, subscribers, looky-loos, whomever, I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for watching Robservations, the show about something. I'm your host, Robert Meyer Burnett. And I say, as I always do, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I say, have a better day. And the Seahawks are playing the San Francisco 49ers tonight or tomorrow night on Monday Night Football. So don't miss that. The Jedi Knights of the Pacific Northwest. Have a better day.